Hello and welcome to this lecture on human perception in immersive environments. In this lecture, we will continue our journey which we started in the last lecture. At the end of today's lecture, you will be able to explain how sensory information is transformed into perceptual experiences. You will be able to describe the role of neural processing in interpreting sensory stimuli. You will be able to explain hierarchical processing in visual perception. You will be able to analyze common perceptual illusions and their relevance to XR, and you will learn how to apply perceptual principles to the design of immersive experiences and environments. So, the opening question I have for you is, well, how does our brain transform the sensory inputs into meaningful experiences? How do we go from sensation to interpretation? Let us recap the previous lecture. Previously, we discussed visual perception, auditory perception, haptic perception, tracking and viewpoint updates, and we also talked about multisensory integration. Today, we will focus on perceptual processing, neural mechanisms, illusions and the design implications. Let us first try to understand perceptual psychology and XR. XR designers frequently encounter questions such as, well, how far away does an object appear, how much resolution is sufficient, how much latency is acceptable, why does cyber sickness occur, and why do some experiences feel more realistic than others. If you can answer these questions, then you can design immersive worlds that people really enjoy. These questions are fundamental questions about perception, and by answering these questions we can create better immersive worlds. To answer these questions, we need to understand three things. First, we need to understand the basic physiology of the human body, including that of the sense organs and neural pathways. We need to understand key theories and insights of experimental perceptual psychology. We also need to understand the interference of the engineered VR system with our common perceptual process and the resulting implications of this interference between the VR system and our common perceptual process and the side effects of the same. So, a number of experiments have been carried out over the years on perceptual processes. This includes, well, understanding how much effort does it require to, for instance, recognize somebody familiar like a family member. When you see someone you know well, the process of recognition starts automatically, finishes immediately and seems to require no effort. Through brain lesion studies, scientists are now able to see the effects when a small part of the brain is not functioning correctly. So, scientists have studied people, for instance, who suffer from prosopagnosia, which makes them unable to recognize the faces of familiar people, including themselves in a mirror, even though nearly everything else functions normally. Scientists have also studied what are known as single unit recordings, which are firings of just one neuron in response to sensory stimuli. So, for example, a single neuron that fires whenever you see a spear. So, what is perception? Well, perception cannot be said to be the same as sensation or sensing something. Sensation is the detection of physical stimuli, for instance, light entering the eye or sound entering the ear. Perception is interpreting that sensory information, for instance, recognizing a friend in a crowd. So, perception is an active process. The brain does not simply record reality. Instead, it filters information, it interprets signals, it fills in missing details and it predicts future events. So, perception is indeed a constructive process. We talked about the perception action loop in the last lecture, where humans continuously observe and then interpret, then act on it and then observe again. So, there is a loop that is going on, where we are observing the environment around us, we are interpreting it, then based on the interpretation we are acting on the environment and then we go back to observing the environment again. This is called the perception action loop. XR systems must support this loop without any noticeable delays. So, the key question is, well, why does perceptual psychology matter in XR? This is because if there is poor alignment with human perception, this can lead to visual discomfort, confusion, reduced realism and motion sickness that the users of the VR environment experience. So, good XR systems work with human perceptual mechanisms rather than against them. So, you need to work with these perceptual mechanisms, which means if you are a designer of immersive systems, you must learn how to use the human perceptual mechanisms well to create better immersive worlds. If we think of our senses, firstly, a sensor which we know from electrical engineering or college physics is something that converts an energy source into signals in a circuit. So, we convert some source of energy which may be voltage or current or flow into signals. Likewise, in our bodies, a stimulus is converted into neural impulses. Each receptor in our body is a sensor which targets a particular kind of stimulus. This is referred to as sensory system selectivity. So, this phenomenon is referred to as sensory system selectivity, where there is a specific receptor for a particular kind of stimulus. In each of our eyes, there are over 100 million photoreceptors that target electromagnetic energy precisely in the frequency range of visible light. Our traditional senses are vision, hearing, touch, taste and smell, but there are other important senses as well. Those are the vestibular sense and the proprioception, which give us a sense of balance and our position in the world. These additional senses are particularly important in XR. So, if we map the human sensors to their engineering equivalent, we can think of the eye as being equivalent to the camera, the ear as being equivalent to the microphone, the skin as being equivalent to a pressure sensor, our vestibular sensor as being equivalent to IMU, an inertial measurement unit, and our nose as being equivalent to a chemical sensor. So, a biological receptor functions much like an engineered sensor. So, there are equivalents in the engineering world for each of the senses that we humans have. Now, we can look at what kind of receptors and sense organs correspond to these senses and what kind of energy is associated with each sense. If you think of the vision, vision is relying on light, which is actually a form of electromagnetic energy, and the receptors we use are photoreceptors which are in our eye. If you think of our auditory sense, there we are using the pressure waves in the air, and for that we have mechanoreceptors in our ear which are actually helping us sense these sounds. For our touch, it is the distortion of our tissue that is actually giving us the stimulus, and for that we have two types of receptors, mechanoreceptors and thermoreceptors. Once when we touch objects, we can sense their temperature and also we can sense the pressure that they are generating on our body. So, for the mechanoreceptors, they are present in the skin and in the muscles, and the thermoreceptors are mainly present in our epithelial outer layer or the skin. Our sense of balance comes from gravity and the acceleration that we are experiencing, and for these again we have mechanoreceptors which are present in our vestibular organs. For our sense of taste, it is a chemical composition of the objects that we are tasting that is giving us an idea about what we are tasting, and for that we are using a chemoreceptors which are present in our mouth and nose. So, we can see that each receptor responds to a specific type of stimulus. For instance, photoreceptors detect visible light, hair cells detect sound vibrations, and thermoreceptors may detect temperature. So, the design implication of this understanding of senses is that as a designer, you must understand that XR displays must stimulate the correct receptors effectively to be able to generate the correct response that is a match for what we are experiencing in the real world. So, how do we go from stimulus to neural signals? Well, the process begins when receptors convert physical energy into neural impulses. For instance, light is converted into neural signals, sound is converted also into neural signals, and so is pressure. So, this process of converting light, sound, pressure, etc., in neural signals is called transduction. The human brain contains approximately 86 billion neurons, and in all of this processing we have heavy involvement of our cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is heavily involved in perception, also in memory, attention, language and decision making that we are involved in every day. Looking at it more closely, the building blocks of perception are what are known as neurons. So, many of you may have come across the term neurons if you have studied biology in your 11th and 12th grades. So, here is the structure of how a neuron looks like. So, its components are dendrites, a cell body and an axon. So, neurons communicate through electrical and chemical signals, where impulses are carried towards the cell body. They are processed here in the cell body, and then the axon carries away the signals from the cell body, and it further branches out and reaches other neurons. So, our body is a network of neurons similar to an enormous directed graph with the usual nodes and directed edges which you can see in a directed graph. The nucleus or cell body of each neuron is a node that does some kind of processing. So, the processing is occurring here. The dendrites are essentially your input edges to the neurons. So, these dendrites are the inputs. Through a network of dendrites, the neuron can aggregate information from numerous other neurons, which themselves may have aggregated information from others. So, this kind of network of dendrites actually helps the neuron aggregate information, and these dendrites may have aggregated the information from other neurons. The result is sent to one or more neurons through what is known as the axon. So, after the processing, the result is sent through the axon. For a connected axon dendrite pair, communication occurs in a gap called the synapse, where electrical or chemical signals are passed along. So, for a connected axon dendrite pair, the communication occurs in a gap, and this gap is known as synapse. Each neuron in the human brain has on average about 7,000 synaptic connections to other neurons, which results in about 10-15 edges in our enormous brain graph. How do we process stimuli? Well, the perception happens after the sense organs convert the stimuli into neural impulses. Our human bodies, as we just saw, contains 86 billion neurons. Around 20 billion are devoted to the part of the brain called the cerebral cortex. This handles our perception and many higher level functions such as attention, memory, language and consciousness. Some animals may actually have more neurons than humans. However, that does not mean that they have higher cognitive abilities. So, the brain works as a processing network. The nervous system can be viewed as a large information processing network. The key features of this processing network are that it has distributed processing, it also involves parallel processing and adaptive learning. So, processing is not necessarily all centralized. There are different areas of the brain which are associated with processing different types of signals, and the processing occurs in parallel. It is not as if one particular stimuli is first processed and then you process another stimuli. You may process multiple stimuli parallelly, and as you process stimuli you keep learning. So, that is the phenomena of what is known as adaptive learning. So, indeed in the brain there is a processing that occurs parallelly, but this processing is also hierarchical. Upon leaving the sense organ receptors, signals propagate among the neurons to eventually reach the cerebral cortex. Through selectivity, each receptor responds to a narrow range of stimuli across time, space, frequency and so on and so forth. Complex patterns are detected using hierarchical processing. In the case of vision, there are feature detectors which appear in the early hierarchical stages, enabling us to detect features such as edges, corners and motion. Now, once in the cerebral cortex, the signals from the sensors are combined with anything else from our life experiences that may become relevant for making an interpretation of the stimuli. Various perceptual phenomena occur such as recognizing a face or identifying a song. So, it is a complex process of processing the stimuli to actually correlate with what we have learnt in our life and then understand it better. So, perception occurs through multiple processing stages. Simple features are detected first, more complex patterns emerge later. This is known as hierarchical processing. Here is how it occurs. Our receptors gather the raw data from the world. They are passed through to intermediate neurons, then through to the thalamus, then through to the primary cortex, then to the secondary cortex, and finally to the higher cortex. And then some decision is taken here, which travels back through to the secondary cortex, then through the primary cortex, and then through to thalamus, and from there on we actually can take some action. So, let us look at feature detection. Because we have specialized neurons which respond to edges, corners, orientation and motion, these form the building blocks for higher level perception. For instance, recognizing a face. Recognizing a familiar face may seem effortless, but it involves feature extraction, pattern matching and memory retrieval, all occur within fractions of a second. Now, what happens when processing fails? An example of when processing fails is prosopagnosia, we just briefly talked about it, or face blindness, where individuals cannot recognize familiar faces despite normal vision. So, this demonstrates that perception involves very specialized neural mechanisms, some of which we highlighted in the previous slides. A number of single neuron studies have been carried out by researchers, where they have identified that neurons respond selectively to specific stimuli. For instance, neurons may respond selectively to faces, motions or shapes. These studies provide insight into how perceptual processing occurs in humans. Now, we move on to the interesting topic of perceptual illusions. Illusions are important because illusions reveal how perception works. They demonstrate that perception is an interpretation rather than a direct copy of reality. So, illusions are features of perception, but not failures. So, you may get illuded to think of something as something else, but that is not necessarily a failure of processing in your brain. Let us look at the Ponzo illusion. In this figure below, which yellow line do you think is longer? The one at the bottom or the one at the top? I reckon many of you think that it is the one at the top. Let us look at this closely. So, here you can see that indeed both of them are of the same length, but we are tempted to think that the one that is farther away is longer. Next, we look at the checker shadow illusion. In this figure, which one is the darker shade of gray? I reckon many of you think that it is A rather than B, which is the darker shade of gray. But if we look closely, if we connect these, we see that they are actually the same shade of gray. So, these illusions are not errors, but they are features of how we perceive the world. Size, distance and motion can be manipulated convincingly. So, we as designers have an ethical and design responsibility in using illusions. As XR designers, we can intentionally leverage these perceptual biases. For instance, we can carry out scale manipulation as we saw in the Ponzo illusion, or we can carry out redirected walking of people, or we can carry out perceived distance enhancement. So, we can enhance the distance in our visual display and show a much larger scene than we would normally. So, these techniques can help improve our experiences while reducing computational requirements. We also need to realize that humans have limitations in resolution perception, motion perception, temporal perception and depth perception. So, we are not perfect beings, we do have a number of limitations. As designers, you need to understand these limits, because that will help you create efficient design. A number of design implications emerge from these studies into perception. Firstly, as designers, you want to be thinking of designing for perceptual limits and not the ideal users. So, what are the limits of our perception? Based on that, we should be designing, and not the best users who can actually distinguish between the illusions, for instance. We need to prioritize our sensory coherence over visual realism. in our efforts at visual realism, we may create very photorealistic images for instance, but if there is no coherence between our senses, then the users will feel a loss of presence and immersion. We need to support users in having agency in the real world. We need to also have predictable interaction. As designers, we need to also test these experiences with real users early, so that the errors which you are making when it comes to human perception are rooted out early. Typical mistakes that designers make or the common design pitfalls involve ignoring this kind of sensory mismatch which we have and the latency in rendering in the displays. We may also experience that complex visual scenes are not well rendered in displays. So, we need to be careful about creating these sorts of complex visual scenes. Scenes may be simpler, but if they give an immersive experience, then they have done the job. We need to be careful about unrealistic or delayed avatar movement. So, latency issues need to be a key focus. We also need to be careful of poor calibration for different users. So, you need to be aware as a designer that your XR system, your immersive world may be experienced by a wide range of users, users who may have disabilities, users who may be from different age groups, users who may be from different genders. So, you need to be careful in calibrating them for different groups of users. So, as a designer, you need to follow some kind of checklist. You may ask before deployment, is it acceptable to have latency in the system? If so, how much? Are the visual cues that you are providing consistent? Is your audio spatially correct? Is the interaction that you are providing predictable? And have users been tested? So, if you have checked all of this, then there is a good chance that the world that you have designed is indeed immersive. To summarize today's lecture, indeed perception is an active constructive process. We have neural systems in our body that transform sensory signals into meaningful experiences. Typically, processing takes place in a hierarchical manner that enables recognition of faces, shapes, motion, etc. We looked at different kinds of illusions and how they can actually fool us, but it also gives us clues into how perception operates. So, illusions are crucial because illusions reveal how perception operates. Effective XR design must align with our perceptual capabilities and limitations. So, as a designer, you must align the capabilities which humans have and their limitations in the design of your hardware as well as your XR apps. With this, I thank you for your attention and I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture.